I never thought that one single night would change everything, that a simple request, a chance touch would set something in motion that could not be undone. But that's exactly what happened. And despite everything, fear, guilt, forbiddenness, I can't say I regret it. It started mundanely. My husband was away again, an important business trip, another meeting, another trip that his business, his career, his world depended on. He wanted me to be like that too. Calculating, composed, the perfect wife for whom marriage is deals, benefits, convenience. I learned to be who he expected. I learned, but I never felt it. The house was filled with silence, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creaking of old wooden floorboards. I sat in the living room, aimlessly running my finger along the edge of a wine glass, while outside the day slowly faded. And then there was a knock. I looked up. "May I?" The voice was steady, but there was tension in it. Nick stood in the doorway. He looked tired. In one hand, he held a cup with the remains of cold coffee. In the other, a book. A worn-out volume that I recognized immediately, an anthology of American poetry. I couldn't help but smile. "Literature? I didn't think you read poetry." "I don't," he frowned slightly, "but I was assigned an analysis, and it doesn't make sense." I gestured for him to sit down at the table, moving the glass aside. He sat across from me, too tall for this kitchen space, but for some reason looking at me as if he was waiting for something. "What seems difficult?" I asked, pushing the book closer. He paused for a moment, then opened a page, running his finger along the lines. "This, about desires and the impossible. It talks about something you can't have, about how you dream of something, knowing you'll never get it. But," I looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "But why? Why desire what you can't touch?" He looked up and his gaze caught me off guard. I didn't immediately know what to say. "Because it makes us alive, Nick. Because it's pain and longing. It's a reminder that we feel." His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but changed his mind. "Have you ever felt that way?" His voice was softer than it should have been. I swallowed. I didn't need to think about it. The answer was obvious, but admitting it out loud would be too dangerous. "Maybe once," I muttered, averting my gaze. Nick didn't respond. I heard him flipping through the pages, but I could feel his gaze, as if he saw something in me that he hadn't noticed before, or something that I tried to hide. I reached for the book again, and our hands accidentally touched. It was just a touch. But neither of us pulled away first. The silence in the room thickened, filled with an electricity that wasn't there before. I felt the warmth of his skin, the faint scent of coffee and something bitter, familiar. It was wrong. I knew it. But why was my heart beating so fast? "I think I'm starting to understand," his voice sounded low, as if struggling through the dense air between us. I exhaled, hoping he wouldn't notice how much this moment affected me. "What exactly?" Nick slowly pulled his hand away, but not immediately. He lingered a fraction of a second longer than necessary before allowing the distance to come between us again. "This feeling, when you know you can't have something, but it makes you want it even more." I didn't know what to say, because if I spoke, my voice would tremble, give me away. And I couldn't allow that. I couldn't let him know that he was right, that I felt the same way. I took the book and opened it, pretending to look for the right page. A long pause. Too long. But Nick didn't look away. "Are you afraid?" His question sounded unexpected. I looked at him, eyes the color of autumn leaves, warm, but also wary, as if he knew he had crossed a line but wasn't sure if he should stop. "Of what?" "Yourself," he said softly. I clenched my teeth. I should have laughed, said it was nonsense. I should have stood up and left, ended this conversation before it was too late. But I didn't leave. The night had long since enveloped the house, plunging it into deep silence. But this silence brought no relief, was not peaceful. It rang with tension, filled with words that were never said. I lay in bed listening to every sound, the creak of floorboards, the soft rustle of wind outside the window, and then footsteps. Nick. I froze. My heart pounded desperately in my chest. He stopped at the door, then without knocking, quietly entered the room. "You're not asleep," he whispered. "Neither are you," I replied, sitting up in bed. He took a few steps, stopping very close. His gaze was dark, full of something I was afraid to name. "This is wrong," I breathed, but there was no conviction in my voice. He leaned in, his face just inches from mine. "Then tell me to leave." I was silent, because I couldn't say it. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The room was dark, but the air was heavy, filled with something hard to explain in words. It seemed as if even the walls remembered what had happened between us a few hours ago. I sat up in bed, running a hand over my face, trying to gather my thoughts. What now? This question echoed in my head again and again, but there was no answer. It was as if I was suspended between the past and the future, between fear and reckless desire. The silence was broken by a barely audible sound. Footsteps outside the door. Nick. He wasn't asleep, just like me. I got up, took a few steps towards the door, but stopped. Was this a mistake? We had gone too far, and now there was no turning back. I heard him exhale, as if gathering his thoughts before speaking. "You're not asleep?" His voice was soft, but there was hesitation in it. "No." My voice sounded louder than I expected. He took a step closer. Now there was only a thin partition between us, just a few centimeters. And I knew, if I opened the door, if I let this happen, there would be no going back. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said. I closed my eyes. The words sank in, settled in my chest with a warm heaviness. I felt the same way. I reached for the doorknob. My hand was shaking. I knew that if I turned it, everything would change. The silence stretched between us. In that silence, there was more than words could convey. It was an admission, an acceptance, a step into the abyss that both of us were afraid to take, but could no longer avoid. And then I opened the door. I woke up early in the morning, before dawn. The room was filled with pale, grayish light filtering through the half-lowered blinds. My body felt heavy, as if I had run a marathon, although in reality, I had barely slept. One thought pounded in my head. What now? Still feeling the warmth of his touch on my skin, I turned my head. Nick was no longer by my side. The sheet next to me was warm, but he was gone. A strange feeling ran down my spine. Relief? Emptiness? I didn't know. I sat up in bed, pulling the sheet over me, as if the thin fabric could protect me from reality. It had happened. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. And now there was only one question burning inside me. How would we live with this? In the distance, I heard a soft sound. Footsteps in the kitchen. He was there. I didn't know what to expect. Thoughts raced through my mind. Would he avoid me? Would he say it was a mistake? Or the opposite? I got up and put on a robe. Trying not to think too much, I went out into the hallway heading towards the kitchen. Nick stood with his back to me, his shoulders tense. Water was boiling in the kettle on the stove, and he was looking out the window as if trying to find answers in the gray pre-dawn sky. "You're up early." My voice sounded softer than I intended. He turned around. His gaze was serious, but there was no regret or embarrassment in it, only calm, quiet acceptance. "I couldn't sleep," he replied. "I was thinking." I swallowed. Of course he was thinking. We both were. I stepped closer, but kept my distance. Between us there was still that silence, thick, heavy, filled with questions. "Do you regret it?" I breathed, unable to hold back. Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't answer immediately, but when he spoke, his voice was firm. But I don't know what now." I nodded, because I didn't know either. We had both gone too far, but what next? Pretend nothing happened? But that would be a lie. Go back? Impossible. And moving forward meant accepting the consequences. Consequences we couldn't predict. "He'll be back in 3 days," I reminded him. Speaking of my husband. Nick closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. "I know." His hands clenched into fists, as if he was struggling with himself. And I saw that he felt the same thing I did, this rift between reason and desire, between morality and truth. "Do you want this to end?" he asked, not looking away. I froze. This was the moment, the decision. We could close this chapter right now, go our separate ways, return to our lives as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't say yes. I took a step forward, feeling my fingers tremble, and he understood my answer without words. He reached out to me, his fingers gently sliding across my cheek before he leaned in closer. "So this isn't the end," he whispered. I closed my eyes, because I knew, no, not the end. This was just the beginning. Time dragged on slowly. The 3 days that seemed like an eternity to me ended just as suddenly as they began. I was waiting for the moment when reality would hit me with full force, and it came. The day my husband returned. In the morning, everything seemed wrong. Even the familiar sounds of the house, the gurgling of water in the pipes, the creaking of old parquet, sounded different. Or maybe it was me who had changed? Nick no longer came to my room. We didn't talk about what happened, but it hung between us in every glance, every movement. He avoided me, and I tried to convince myself that it was for the best. But was it? I heard the front door slam. "Clara?" My husband's familiar voice echoed in the hallway. I took a deep breath, holding the air in my lungs. For a few seconds, it seemed as if the house had become what it was before. Ordinary, simple, safe. "I'm in the kitchen," I replied, trying to sound calm. I heard footsteps, and then he entered. Tall, confident, with a hint of fatigue in his eyes. He smiled, but something in that gaze made me tense. Maybe I was just seeing more now. "How were the last few days?" he asked, setting his suitcase against the wall. "Quiet," I shrugged. "Everything as usual." As usual. The lie seemed strained. My skin remembered the warmth of Nick's hands, my lips, his kisses, and that feeling didn't go away, despite my attempt to act as if nothing had happened. I felt someone stop behind me. Nick. I didn't turn around, but I could feel his gaze. "Nick, hi!" My husband smiled, patting him on the shoulder. "How are you?" "Not bad," he replied briefly, but I noticed how he tensed. This moment lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed endless to me. It seemed to me that Nick was about to say something else, but then he just nodded and left, leaving us alone. In the evening, we sat at dinner, like the perfect family. I talked, laughed in the right places, but inside I felt empty. My husband talked about his trip, about the people he met. I listened, but the words passed me by. As I cleared the plates, he suddenly said, "You seem tense. Is everything okay?" I froze for a second, but then forced a smile. "Of course, just tired." "Are you sure?" He looked at me intently, too intently. Something inside me trembled. I realized that if he asked again, if he kept looking at me like that, I wouldn't be able to hold out. "Everything's fine," I repeated. I went to the bedroom earlier than usual. I locked myself in the bathroom, looking in the mirror, trying to see in the reflection the woman I was before. But she wasn't there. I could no longer go back. Later, lying in bed, I listened to Nick moving around the house. At some point, I heard the front door open and close. He left. What now? What happens next? I didn't know. But one thing I knew for sure, consequences always catch up with us, even if we pretend we can run from them.